Thank you for joining us for this webinar, Responding to Domestic and Family Violence as a Workplace Issue. Community Legal Centres Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding this presentation, the Turrbal and the Jagera people here in Brisbane. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders continue to play in our society. As this presentation is being viewed through Queensland and Australia, we also pay respect to traditional owners of the land throughout the country and extend a warm welcome to any First Australians listening to this presentation. We also acknowledge the disproportionately high rates of domestic violence experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the additional challenges this creates in responding to this issue. This webinar is part of our series Building Capacity in Domestic Violence for Community Legal Centres. It's funded by the Queensland Department of Justice and the Attorney-General through the Victim Assist Queensland's Victim Services Building Capacity program. We thank them for their support. Please take a moment to read the important information on this screen and visit our Keep Safe website anytime. At the end of this presentation, there will be time to ask questions. If you have a question, you can let us know at any time. You can send it through by typing into the question bar on your dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can raise your hand if you wish us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question in person at the end. For now, I introduce our presenter, Kerriann Dear. Kerriann has a wealth of experience in this area. She's currently the co-director at Basic Rights Queensland and has previously worked as the CEO of the Queensland Working Women's Service. I know that you join me in welcoming Kerriann for the webinar, and I look forward to your questions at the end. Thanks, Kerriann.
Thanks, Stephanie, and hello everybody, and thanks for taking the time out to do this seminar with me today. We've got a few simple aims. It is less than an hour, so we have a lot of material to get through. I'll go fairly fast, but I'm happy to answer any questions, whether they come up during the session or at the end, and I'm certainly happy to be contacted afterwards in my capacity at Working Women Queensland. It's a bit of a passionate area for me. It's 20 years of seeing domestic violence arising in the workplace, and for at least probably 15 of those years seeing some pretty poor responses to it. But a lot's changed, and there still is a lot of change, to come. So the seminar basically today will, hopefully provide you with a basic understanding of why domestic and family violence is a workplace issue. We'll just check in with some of the complexities of domestic and family violence. Obviously, we're aiming to enhance safety of workers and workplaces in general, and assist with job security for people who experience domestic and family violence. And probably most of you know that there's now national entitlements to leave pretty much for all workers, award-based workers and National Employment Standard workers throughout Australia, and I'll talk to that towards the end. And then just looking at some, we're hoping that they are best practice, but we're looking at how workplaces in all their diversity can support employees experiencing domestic and family violence. And once again, we'll be looking at an overview of the legislative entitlements. So look a little bit about domestic and family violence. That's really where we're sort of starting. And I know that many of you are probably attending quite a few of these seminars, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time around definitions. And there's so much information around, on the web, our Watch website, White Ribbon, your local domestic and family violence service that can provide you with much more detailed information that I'll be providing today. But I'm going to focus on why domestic violence is a workplace concern and how we can respond. Once again, the other comments there are really consistent with the aims I've just talked about. So we've got a case study, and this is a real live, just de-identified case that Working Women's Centre had a couple of years ago. We've called the client Judy. She worked in a family support role for a not-for-profit up in North Queensland. She experienced domestic and family violence in an ongoing nature. periodic and cyclical, and after it had reoccurred over a weekend break, she disclosed to her employer that she was worried that her partner was agitated and that he would come to work looking for her, and she said that she was feeling unsafe. The employer didn't really indulge in asking too many questions, but basically said to Judy that she needed to leave the workplace immediately, and that they wouldn't be able to continue to employ her because they just couldn't undertake, that they could keep her safe, and they were concerned about the threat to the workplace in general. So it was a fairly unsatisfactory experience for Judy, experiencing DV, all the stresses associated with that, and then losing her employment. So she contacted Working Women Queensland, and we made an unfair dismissal application. There's a number of avenues of redress we possibly could have chosen, but because of the fairly speedy response of an unfair dismissal, we found ourselves in a conciliation conference a few weeks later. The employer by this stage had done a little bit more homework and was actually quite apologetic, and certainly conceded that it could have done a lot better, and that in fact it undertook at the conference, apart from paying some compensation to Judy in the vicinity of 6 weeks' wages. Judy was a relatively short-term employee. She'd had a long employment history with a previous employer. The employer conceded that it could have done things better, and it undertook to uphold a policy that it was going to implement. So that probably it's a fairly typical scenario that we certainly in the older times experienced at Working Women's. We've had a range of responses from employers over the past few years, from getting definitely over-involved or not having satisfactory policies to guide what they're actually doing and trying to assist the person, or otherwise, sometimes we've had the zero tolerance situations where they've basically said things like, well, you can keep your job if you leave your partner. So showing a real lack of understanding of the whole context of domestic and family violence. So, look, it's a workplace concern. The data tells us that. The number of women who work and the frequency of domestic and family violence in both genders, but particularly women, would indicate that it's going to raise its head in our workplaces from time to time. It's a workplace issue because a lot of the various tactics and behaviours associated with domestic and family violence actually impact the workplace, because behaviours happen at work. And it might not be, in a face-to-face situation, but being at work for a period of time during the day or on a shift provides the perpetrator of domestic and family violence with a location where the employee and the victim of the experiencing the violence is likely to be, and avenues such as phone, email, text messages, or stalking the workplace to continue to perpetrate the violence. I mean, the tactics also can be quite sophisticated, and we've actually had people lose their positions because partners or ex-partners perpetrating, abuse have actually reported things to employers that employers have believed, and women have lost their employment as a consequence. It's important to recognise that there's a whole impact of domestic and family violence at work, not just on the employee and potential loss of income and job security, but on co-workers. It's important to recognise how a traumatised person may actually be presenting at work, because the issue may not actually be apparently domestic and family violence. It's a whole range of mental and physical health symptoms, absenteeism, presenteeism, unreliability, decline in work performance, but also, that the person just may be not quite themselves, or, I think trauma is also something I think we're going into in this series. So, how a traumatised person may not actually appear to be totally rational or present consistent stories or versions of what's actually happening if they're asked about what's happening in their lives. And also workplaces, why do they need to respond and how can they respond? Well, certainly policies, practices, support, building skills and knowledge, and having workplace entitlements can certainly make a huge difference as part of a community response to domestic and family violence. So briefly, definitions, and I'm not going to read those out. You can see those for yourself. We use this in our training, but also the Queensland Act is very comprehensive. The important things to take away is that it happens across genders, it happens across all socio-economic and cultural settings, and that it takes a number of different forms. And they're just identifying a few. And if you go to Our Watch or any of the local DV service provider websites, you'll see the range of behaviours that it may include. So just a couple of facts. Obviously my history is at the Working Women's Centre. I've also worked with men who've experienced domestic and family violence in a private practice setting. I guess it's one of those things that you build a picture of from practice experience, but as I said before, there is so much information about there now about how common it is and the impact on victims that it's actually hard to escape in our society. But in relevance to work, 2 in 3 women who report domestic and family violence are in paid employment. We know this from some research that's been done, and primarily that came out of Ludo McFerrin's research in 2011, where 1 in 5 women reported that the domestic and family violence they'd experienced had actually interfered with their capacity to work. So some more statistics for you about the enormous cost to the economy. The really bleak picture for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, which the task force led by Dame Quinton Bryce in 2015, I think it was, just painted the picture as bleak and certainly much higher, disproportionate to the rest of the population. We also know that across cultures and with diverse populations, that culture and attitudes also heavily impact on the ability of people experiencing violence to report violence and to seek help. And we know that definitely outside of culture, and reflected in our education, our media and workplaces, there's all there's a huge role that these institutions play in shaping our attitude and understanding and responding to domestic and family violence. Men also experience abuse, but I think I've jumped a slide. So we know that 1 in 3, we are back on the slide, thanks Stephanie. 1 in 7 women, and this is from the Our Watch data, has experienced emotional abuse, and 1 in 19 physical abuse. So it's still there, it's just at a much lesser rate than what women experience. Women also commit acts of violence against male and female partners. And we know from the research that men and LGBTIQ plus people may be even less likely to report the violence than women, people who identify as women. Issues of intersectionality, including race, language, sexuality, they can all make it really complex in ability to report or to seek assistance. And we also know that cultural practices and other kinds of trauma, refugee trauma, previous sexual or childhood abuse can expose all people, but particularly immigrant and refugee women, to risks of further violence. So I think I did jump a slide, but I think you've got the data there, and I think that everybody's pretty au fait with the 1 woman a week killed by a partner or a former partner in Australia, and I think this year we're actually travelling a little higher than that. In the last 12 months. I haven't seen the data that's come out yet. I mentioned before Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it can't go unremarked. An estimated 25% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women have reported experiencing acts of violence in the past 12 months. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are 6 times more likely to report DV, but 35 times more likely to be hospitalised. So the violence is on the extreme spectrum. And we also know that there are huge barriers, including incarceration of family members or partners, fear of reprisals, removal of children. There's a huge and layered history here for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to, report, but also to act, to intervene in the cycle of violence. So back to the workplace, 2/3 of Australian women experiencing domestic and family violence have jobs, they're employed. A lot of these women we know actually are casually or precariously employed, but they have an attachment to the labour market, with 1 in 5 saying that the violence continues at work when they're experiencing violence. And surprisingly, between 25 and 50% report having lost a job, at least in part to the violence. And there's a complexity of issues associated with, indirectly with violence as well, including just being able to get to work. We've had women report things like car keys being hidden, refusal to participate in childcare or take kids to childcare, just degradation and minimisation of the role the job plays in the family income, or physically being restrained from actually getting to work. And of all the data here, a huge amount is not reported to the police each year. 9 in 10 is the estimate as Queensland Government and ABS Stats estimate. So we are talking the tip of the iceberg that's just apparent to us. Plus the huge cost to Australian workplaces of $175 million a year. That stat's a few years old. That was from when we started doing the training in 2016. So possibly it's higher. So, it's a complex matter. Why I'm going to put it back to you, or I don't know whether you want to jot some notes down or you want to type something in. Is there anything we've left unturned? Why do you think understanding domestic and family violence is important in our workplaces?
If anyone wants to write a note about that, feel free to type it into your dashboard and I can read it out as part of the webinar, or we can come back to that later.
We'll keep an eye on that space. So, look, and I was going to say that, I think the important thing to remember, it's a complex matter, and that, context is everything. Every workplace is different. Every employee has a slightly different experience of work. We've got a multitude of industries, occupations. We've got gendered workplaces, white collar, pink collar, blue collar. We've got industries, manufacturing, administrative industries. Think about where you work, think of the clients, think of your family. We all work in different ways. And so every instance of domestic and family violence is going to have, a subtly or a grossly different impact.
And as Kylie points out, just answering that question, we all have a duty of care to be dealing with this in all these complex situations.
Thanks, Kylie, and there's more on that to come. So yeah, I think we're getting the picture that actually, domestic and family violence happens at work, and it can happen in our own workplaces. We need to be alert and certainly start to act to manage the risks. So in knowing the risks, I think while workplaces, in a workplace health and safety framework, need to make their own assessments and act to certainly respond and manage risks. There's certain factors that I think, at building an understanding of domestic and family violence, contribute to having a knowledge about, what might be a risk here. Certainly having women in the workplace is a risk factor. It's whether you're going to consider risk factors or correlated factors, then we've just jotted down here some of the factors that you need to consider. Certainly previous experience of domestic and family violence, whether in that relationship or a previous relationship, or a perception of harm rising from domestic and family violence, a risk factor. So if someone's actually afraid, although nothing might have happened yet in a physical way, people living in isolation, away from other family members, friends, communities, living remotely, apparent excessive control or jealousy by partners, separation, whether recent or historical, is a risk factor. Women are more vulnerable when establishing new relationships, new partners, unknown things, that whole letting your guard down when you start a new relationship, people being on their best behaviour, sometimes not knowing who the person really is that you're entering into a relationship with. Certainly child arrangement and child access conflicts, issues around stepchildren. There's a whole multitude of things here, but none of these things actually notably cause domestic and family violence, but they may be associated and they may, may be correlated. So certainly something that's come up in the training when we've worked with multicultural people is that they've talked about not just fear, or actually not fear of their partner, but fear of their extended family or a family that they've married into, that the violence might not be physical violence, but there might be lots of abuse happening, in that context, and non-approval of that relationship by other family members. Sometimes that can lead to intimate partner violence, sometimes not, but certainly, we're talking about power and control dynamics here, and we'll get a little bit more into that. And of course, we probably, every time we've done training, we in our longer sessions, we do have a bit of a talk about, drug and alcohol abuse issues and mental health issues, but also financial and stress issues. They're all, can be seen to be correlated with domestic and family violence. So when often at work, that some of these things are happening for co-workers through just, quiet or sometimes quite public conversations in the workplace. Or you might get a sense because of tensions or conversations that aren't meant to be overheard, or just seeing someone distracted at work, receiving lots of text messages or emails, or being very concerned about their children or about family members or pets, or being very anxious when there's handover times for children in separated families where there's shared care.
One of the questions we've just had come through, Kerriann, is where people are getting a sense that this may be going on for a co-worker, how they approach that issue with the co-worker.
Absolutely, yes, we're going to be talking to that too. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. It's just important, and I'm not going to harp on this slide. You've got it here. You can take the time to read it, and there's lots of information available on the web about the cyclical nature of power and control, particularly in intimate partner violence. And the Dulles Centre, in Minnesota, really did groundbreaking modelling around this from the women they'd worked with, over decades. And notably, the arrows are fairly faint in this slide, but there's a cycle. While every case is different, there's often an identifiable cycle. And for people to be aware of, if any workplace is looking at doing an intervention or there's curiosity or wanting to understand what might be going on for an employee, it might be important to know actually what phase of the cycle is happening. Obviously, when there's been an explosive phase, when there's actually physical injuries, or there's been emotional or mental health issues arising from the domination submission tactics used by perpetrators, then that explosive phase is often actually a time where intervention or disclosure is most likely. That the violence is palpable, it's prevalent, the risk is obvious. It might be time also too that people want to make the break from the relationship, or have been planning for a long time to make the break. But if it goes into the next phase, which is the reconciliation and making up phase, then it becomes less likely that there's an opportunity actually to raise awareness or to make an effective referral, because often what happens after that is temporary calm, or promises are made, there's no overt violence taking place. The abuse is often really minimised or actually denied by both parties, and until it starts again when the build-up phase happens. And once again, that's possibly an opportunity for disclosure to occur, or to approach somebody when they might be working on eggshells or making attempts to placate the person using the violence because they're very worried about what's going to happen. Just a useful thing to have up your sleeve, but also I just put this in because I think it's good for us to, you do this stuff sometimes, you can sometimes see, abuse or violence under lots of mushrooms that you look under, but it's also good to know what a healthy relationship looks like, and to just check in for yourself sometimes, or to check in with others, about equality and trust. And, it doesn't mean we can't have, gendered work arrangements or gendered childcare arrangements. It's just really about some fundamentals of, being able to negotiate and having power within that relationship in the cycle of non-violence. So back to the workplace. This is from Ludo McFerrin's study again. this was the impact noted in the research of what co-workers commented on observing impacts of those they knew were being affected by domestic and family violence. It was obviously, impact on work performance and ability to be an effective worker. Absenteeism was a huge one, disruptions at work, experiencing harassment and abuse at work. And certainly what came across in the research was that, a lack of understanding or empathy not only, might just result in straight out performance management or intolerance from work colleagues, but also can lead to discrimination. I'm not talking necessarily about unlawful discrimination, but treating that person in a marginalised or less favourable way and them experiencing alienation at work as well. They're no longer a team player, or they're letting people down, and especially if domestic and family violence isn't identified as the cause, it can lead to a lot of persecution.
One of the comments that we've had come in is about the experience of some people in multicultural communities in particular who experience work as a safe haven.
Absolutely.
And at work can appear, in fact, overzealous or over-enthusiastic, and that in turn can be seen as a negative in some cases.
Yeah, absolutely. Or over presenteeism, actually not wanting to go home, working beyond hours, staying at work, holding on to that relationship or that experience of work because it is a safe place. It's a really good point. It's a really important thing to remember, that work should and it needs to be a safe place. So some of the work colleagues in the study reported, feelings of resentment, having to fill in or backfill for absent workers or distracted workers, trying to actually prevent the victim or person experiencing violence from unwanted contact at work, but overwhelmingly feeling helpless and unsure about what to do. Experiencing their own vicarious trauma, health, fears, anxiety, compassion, fatigue, having to take stress leave because, vicariously they also were going through perhaps what their co-worker was going through. Certainly in the training as well, and we know people can get over-involved and putting their own sometimes health and safety at risk, but also too sort of inappropriately involved when in actual fact, a specialist DV service is actually what's really required to actually make a proper assessment about safety. And we're not really going to talk about this today, but it's a huge one and subject of other specialist training. Identifying perpetrators in the workplace. What do you do if you suspect that, a co-worker, the person sitting next to you, your boss, your employee, is perpetrating domestic and family violence? What if they're using work resources to perpetrate domestic and family violence? What if you see that some others in the workplace are colluding with the perpetrator? We know that often perpetrators of abuse and violence can be quite skilled and quite charming in actually denigrating and the person that they're abusing, and can also sometimes appear, and police report this quite commonly, they appear more rational, more believable than the person making claims of experiencing the violence. So once again, complex matters. So if you want to make some notes for your own learning, or you want to sort of have a go at typing in, or you just want to keep listening. It's a weird thing about delivering a webinar. I don't know, I can't see your faces, can't see if you're nodding or you're not in agreement. But what do you think would be some of the key risks and the impacts that employers face? So think about it, and you will be in different roles. Some of you might be in management, might be employers. What happens? What are the risks that you face? Someone talked earlier, was it Kate, about your duty of care as an employer. Obviously, it's fairly significant. So if I don't see the screen bouncing up with input, I'll go into just talking a little bit about that. But good to sort of get thinking, because sometimes you have to put yourself in different shoes to fully understand a context. Well, obviously, no employers really want, domestic and family violence to be happening in their workplace, but there are issues for both victims and perpetrators of domestic and family violence. And obviously, the same way co-workers purported it, reduced productivity, performance and morale impact on the bottom line at work, whether you're for profit or not for profit, but it's going to impact on your efficiencies and what you're achieving in your workplace. Potentially staff turnover can be huge. We know that particularly for women, there's a loose attachment to the labour market and there's a high casualisation, and the reason for that sometimes or often is that women engage for short periods of time in a casual way, and when domestic and family violence occurs, they move on. They'll have a period of unemployment or unattachment and then connect to another job. Once again, like if you've got to manage someone for poor performance and there's a domestic and family violence issue, it's a very much a tread carefully scenario. There's risks of unfair dismissal. We'll talk to that in a sec. Adverse action or general protections provisions being invoked, or for claims of discrimination. It's a harder one to access, but it's still there. If you're an employer, you might have to manage scenarios of having the perpetrator in the same workplace as the victim. And obviously you've got moral, social and ethical responsibilities, workplace health and safety responsibilities. I think we've just got to watch the space here, like getting our regulators on board with this as a workplace health and safety issue is an absolute must. And potentially also workers' compensation and personal injuries claims. So just a few for any of you who have your employer or your manager hat on. But let's go to it. There's one case in particular that highlights this. So this was a case 2015 where the victim or the person using violence and the person experiencing the violence were in the same workplace. In this situation, it didn't come out in the case, there was an assumption the male was the primary perpetrator, but they had taken out domestic violence orders against each other. And that is not uncommon, as many of you may know, something the courts have to tangle with and grapple with. But often, that will happen, particularly where there has been two-way violence, and it may not always be clear where the primary perpetration is coming from. But very quickly, the employer made the decision to terminate the female employee without any sort of investigation or procedural fairness. They weren't prepared to terminate the male partner in the relationship. He held a more senior position in the organisation, and that it was assessed that not only would the workplace not be a safe or nice place to continue if they both lived there, but she had a more, replaceable skill set. So the Commission's decision was pretty clear: harsh, unjust and unreasonable. It was upheld, and they claimed that the Commissioner said the workplace clearly failed to provide evidence that the dismissal was in any way related to the employee's capacity or conduct. They were ordered to pay compensation. She had been relatively short term, so I think it fell short of the 6-month maximum cap in this jurisdiction. But if you want to have a look further, there's a link there. There's the name of the case. So a couple other questions that we might want to think about. It raises lots of questions about, well, what extent do employers have to accommodate such matters as domestic violence orders in the workplace? What should be their primary considerations? The workplace, in this case, said they didn't think the workplace would be a very nice place to be. Were they talking about safety? Were they talking about productivity? Were they talking about the impact on the bottom line? You can see that this is one where there could have been lots of other options explored and considered by the employer. But once again, if you'd like to think about those, we're going to be talking about them in a sec. But if you're a person like me that likes to think in advance, what else could the employer have been thinking about? Obviously there's just so many things that they could have done in a practical way to keep the parties separate. And that's just where, it does call on employers to be creative, not just in these circumstances, but when someone makes a right to request leave under such circumstances if they are experiencing or impacted by domestic and family violence. So I think we've probably established a good case that domestic and family violence is a workplace issue, and the Fair Work Commission last year agreed in providing access to 5 days paid leave to all employees around Australia, including casuals. Through enterprise bargaining, there's a close to, I think University of Sydney were doing some research on this. I don't know if it's actually been published yet, but they told me that they've estimated that 2 million workers now have access through enterprise bargaining agreements. So that's mostly union agreements. There's also, we have industrially the decision by the Fair Work Commission was to put leave into modern awards, and the federal government has just legislated for universal unpaid leave this year. So sorry, I've got my sequence of events wrong. The Fair Work Act also provides for a right to request a flexible work arrangement. I'm going to go into that in a sec. There are some limited protections on the basis of discrimination, especially if you can tie the domestic and family violence to gender or family responsibilities. We had a case recently, Legal Aid in Queensland ran, where there were gendered comments made about employing women, but it wasn't upheld because it wasn't actually that, it was actually a case of gender discrimination. But we're yet to see case law that reflects the gendered nature, but potentially, there will be claims. And workplace health and safety, as I said, we have obligations to make our workplaces, we all have obligations, but particularly high on employers to make our workplaces free from stress and harassment, to keep them safe. And I've mentioned the NES and modern awards. So I'm not going to read the slide. You can see it there. It's all laid out because I'm sure we have a few lawyers in the other end of the computers. These are the relevant sections of the Act. If you want to have if an employee makes a request for a flexible work arrangement, there are some premises, but it's for a person experiencing violence from a member of that person's family, or if they're actually providing direct care or support to a member of their immediate family, they have a right to make a flexible work arrangement. That request needs to be made in writing to the employer, and the employer, go to the next slide, I think has a duty to respond within 14 days. There's a couple of conditions. They must be employed at least 12 months or be a casual on a regular and systematic basis for 12 months. And that written request must outline the details of the changes and the reasons for the changes. Now, this is actually an important thing to remember if you're working with someone around an industrial matter, around domestic and family violence, because that right to request actually sets up an alert to the employer that they're actually experiencing a domestic and family violence situation. And if that request is refused, which it can be on reasonable business grounds, there's no actual right to have the leave, but it's a right to request a flexible work arrangement. If that leads to some sort of adverse action, i.e. dismissal or a negative change in employment, then this is actually the workplace right. For those of you who are employment lawyers, this is the workplace right that's invoked. So if they've enacted this workplace right and there's been adverse action, this is something that can be relied on. A little technicality, but otherwise it's pretty hard with adverse action or discrimination to get cases up on the basis of domestic violence alone. There's template letters if you're assisting someone on the Fair Work website. The address is there. And for those of you with manager or employer responsibilities, or just to know what the other side need to do, they have to seriously consider the request and respond once again in writing. They're supposed to only be able to refuse on reasonable business grounds, but once again, there's no provision in the Act for actually bringing them, unless it's actually a right in an enterprise agreement, for bringing it to the Commission's attention if the reply actually is disingenuous or doesn't seem to be based on reasonable business grounds. But the Act sets up a process for communication and negotiation between employer and employees, and it's not limited to just this. It's quite clear that employers can go above and beyond this. That they can provide much more support than just a reasonable, considering a flexible work arrangement or providing leave. I'll keep going. So that's just a little bit more on the right to requests. If we duck to the next slide. This is what I talked briefly about before. So, the Act says that an employer and a person must not take adverse action in the workplace because the person has a workplace right, and that's, a right to request a reasonable work arrangement. They don't have a right not to experience domestic violence or not to be treated differently because of domestic and family violence. It's not a grounds for discrimination yet. We might see that change. They mustn't take adverse action to prevent the person exercising that right. So it is a complex piece of law, but if there is that right to request being made and there is adverse action has happened, it's the one link that can be made to get the attention of the Commission if that's desired by the, with everything person experiencing violence has going on, it may not be contesting their employer, particularly if they're still employed, may not be, the course of action that they want to take at that time. But certainly if the adverse action is dismissal, it's another provision that actually could be invoked if that right to request has been made. So look, our catchphrase, and this is our 3.5-hour training, which we always say should be full day training, but we've adopted, it's an international approach. The Queensland Government also adopted the first 3: recognise, respond and refer. We've added record and review to that because we think workplaces can be valuable sources of evidence when abuse is occurring, in the workplace. When there's phone records or email records or witnesses, then sometimes when a DVO is being applied for, those records can actually come in handy. And we say review because if you are having a workplace response, it's actually good to review how's it going. Has it ever been used? If it was used, was it effective? What happened? What worked? What didn't work? What could we do better? So ours is quite comprehensive. As I said, we do the 3.5-hour training if you're interested. Certainly contact me if your workplace wants to go there. So I just tried to compress this 3.5-hour training into the remaining few minutes of the seminar. But if you're a first responder at work, and there was a question I think was Alan answered before, or someone commented before, or you are the responsible person, you're the manager, you're the supervisor, you're the employer, you've become aware that domestic and family violence is happening to a person you employ or work with, or you strongly suspect it. Either they've approached you and disclosed, or you feel that things have gotten to a point where you need to make an approach. Well, what do you do? So obviously, having an understanding before you make an approach, what do I know about domestic and family violence? What are the signs that I've seen that indicate that this might be the case here? What has the person told me? Disclosures are not often, I'm experiencing domestic and family violence at home, and this is what's happening, and this is what I'm going to do about it. It can be, comments such as, gee, my partner has a bad temper, or seeing signs of injuries, stating fear, or if it's family violence, it might be about don't want this to just be about intimate partner violence. Fear of the family member, or seeming to be nervous, or just making those comments, or clock watching, needing to race out at 4:30 or 5 o'clock because someone's waiting outside to pick them up. Knowing enough so that when and if they disclose to you, or if you're going to make an approach, that you're not appearing to be judgmental, because certainly any approach, it's really important that there's not victim blaming happens. I know that's a 101. But comments like, how can you put up with that? I'm so surprised that it's happening to you. They're actually quite unhelpful. If there is a disclosure happening, or you've raised it and a disclosure is happening as a consequence, listening is your best tool. Listen to what they're telling you. Let them know that you believe them, and then if you're using active listening, I'm sure most of you have done long or short careers, some training on active listening, reflect back to them. What have they told you? Check in. Don't make assumptions, but, just keep getting the facts established with them. Certainly, and if you're being approached, it will obviously often be in a confidential context where they've begged you to keep this quiet, even if you're a manager or a co-worker. Or you approach them and say, look, I'm just confidentially talking to you, but, we might need to have a broader chat. But, seek permission before you go any further. While you've got workplace health and safety obligations, having that permission is probably one of the most effective tools in getting them on board to take further steps to allow your workplace to, undertake an effective intervention, but also so things don't escalate out of their control. If they've made one disclosure, or they're even just checking in with you to see if they think that you think this might be domestic and family violence. Before you go and talk to your manager or your supervisor, or if you think it's a good idea, check in with them. Check in with them too in terms of their knowledge capacity, and ask them if they understand what, their own the workplace's policies, or what the workplace can do. Certainly not asking for details of the violence or about what's going on in their personal life, but particularly if you're a manager, the higher you are, the higher level of responsibility you have for safety. Ask them what impact it's having on their work life. Is this, is it impacting on your performance? Is this the reason that you've been absent? Is this the reason that you're getting so many calls? Try to establish that clear workplace link. Let them know of what their options are, whether you have a policy. This is where referrals, and if you're a manager, if you're a workplace, it's good to have current, up-to-date, effective and local referral information for specialist DV services. I can't underestimate that. It's a whole 10 slides in itself, but I'll provide you with some resources towards the end. Asking the employee what they want you to do and what they want to do themselves. Don't think that you know best. They may have a whole different series of events in mind, which may include, leaving employment or doing a right to request. Don't tell them what to do, but let them know what their options are. Once again, safety. If there's imminent violence, if there's imminent risk to safety, you actually have an obligation to act. If you make that assessment, you need to clarify with them and say, look, I know you've told me in confidence, but there's somebody outside, with a weapon or a knife, or you've told me that there's something going to happen tonight or this afternoon that I need to take some steps, and I'd really like you to be on board with me. Clarify what you're going to do. Don't presume they agree. So, look, safety planning at work is really important, and for anyone charged with this, a workplace health and safety officer or involved, it's a comprehensive assessment. We do have a tool that we do actually training on a fee-for-service basis, but there is, if you click this link, because it's really hard to find through Googling, there is one that's been developed by Queensland Government for Queensland Government employees. It's a little bit clanky and it's not comprehensive, but it's not a bad start about what questions you should be asking. How complex your risk assessment is going to depend on your own knowledge and understanding, but certainly a good place to start is asking someone if they feel safe and what do they think the risks at work might be. Some workplaces go into personal safety planning. It's not something that DV Workaware and I guess in our experience we've really promoted. We believe that personal safety planning is best done by a specialist agency. So referrals to the DV service or Women's Legal Service, or to the Women's Legal Service website where there's a template. So the person can get an understanding of their own risk to their safety, because one of the biggest things that we hear, aside from minimising the violence, is that people didn't understand that it could escalate so fast, or that, a relationship that they thought was unsatisfactory could actually escalate into severe violence at the time of separation. So there's so many things to consider. Once again, more training to do. Some considerations, and these are sort of basic ones at work. If you should be asking if there is a protection order in place. If it includes the workplace, a copy should definitely be kept at work. It's quite a powerful tool to be able to tell the police that the order's been breached. You've got a copy of the order and the perpetrator's in the workplace. They need to get there straight away. Basic safety planning for arriving at work, leaving at work. Things like, is the car park well lit? Suggesting or working with the employee that maybe they change the way they travel to work, or adjusting start and finish time so they don't have this pattern that can be tracked. Just checking in with them about how their own e-safety is. There's once again lots of tools available on the internet, and Women's Legal have tools. How safe is your phone? How can you tell if you're being stalked? What are things besides changing your phone number and your email address you can do so you don't have an e-footprint that can be can be traced pretty easily. And just there's safety stuff at work, like, is there a risk that the employees going to be, visited at work? Should there be a sign-in, sign-out? Should there be a photo of the perpetrator at reception? Obviously, a lot more complexities when the perpetrator's in the workplace, and it just depends. I'm so reluctant to say the degree of the violence because things can escalate, but it's so contextual that if they are working together, what's your response? Secondments, as someone suggested before, changing workplaces if you're a big enough employer, putting up walls of no access, putting in place, periods or contacts that can't be had between employees who might just work with the same employer but in different areas. Queensland Health had a few, when we were training some of the nurses, they had some good examples of this. He worked in, hospital maintenance, she was a nurse. There's no reason why their paths should actually cross, but they're in the same employer, and actually there could be contact made through hospital intranets and things like that. So it's a lot of common sense, but having an understanding, once again, guides those common sense, considerations. So useful resources. We're nearly out of time. There's just a list there. These are Brisbane-based, and I know that a lot of you are not in Brisbane. So Daisy is your best friend there. It's a downloadable app, and it's got local services throughout Australia, the DAISY. You can Google that and download it. It's not hard to find a your local service provider. They will typically come up first if you just write domestic violence service. They've got pretty good search engines there. Optimised search engine. I can't remember the catch right for that. Just heard it last week for the first time. And look, thank you. There's plenty more to know, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Kerriann. If anyone has questions, feel free to type them into the question pane on your dashboard now. We did have a question come in earlier before the webinar asking about what kind of evidence an employer might need, or how to balance the need for some evidence to tick your own internal bureaucratic boxes, say, with your desire to give the employee all of their rights and entitlements.
Absolutely. So this entitlement to a minimum of 5 days unpaid leave, and as I said, many workplaces have a much higher entitlement, and including paid leave. It's up to the employer to specify what the bar of evidence actually is for that. So a common sense approach that we promote is that any professional type role who's involved in assisting the person, like a specialist service provider, their legal advisor or community legal service advisor, or social worker, doctor, or a statutory declaration can sometimes suffice. It's just, once again, it sort of goes back to being reasonable and what could be reasonably provided. I'm experiencing domestic and family violence. I've got to get the heck out of here tonight. I'm moving house. It's just happened now. Probably not going to have a lot of time to provide evidence, but it's sort of that as soon as possible. That would trigger their entitlement to 5 days leave, and the employer, unfortunately, sort of in some ways doesn't have much time for planning or backfill. But if it's a more planned or strategic approach, or in 3 weeks I've got a legal appointment and I need the afternoon off, because the leave doesn't have to be taken at once. In 1 week's time, I'm going to need 2 days off to move house. Or tomorrow the locks are being changed. I'd like to invoke my entitlement to leave, to be at home to have the locks changed. So it's a really practical driven approach. But I think most employers, look, in my experience, if they've got a sense that it's genuine, actually they do start to bend over backwards to be accommodating. I mean, once again, there's always a bottom, there's always a line.
Can you tell us a bit more about the training that might be available through your organisation or others, Kerriann, for people who want more information on the topic?
Yeah, sure. So domestic violence work aware, DV work aware, can be Googled. We were a program of the National Working Women's Centres. We've now got a national training program. We're mostly delivering in our own states, but we're sort of fairly coordinated. We've developed, we'd love to deliver it over a day, but we found that most people only were prepared to pay for or attend a half a day training, and most people wanted it all done in an hour. But yeah, it's a reasonable cost, particularly to not-for-profits organisations. We will come to you. We do sort of ask that you provide the venue and, you know, some refreshments and do all the organising. We are in the process of doing and developing some community-based seminars, so they would be open to the public. We're just actually trying to get some seed funding to get those up and running. But certainly, look, contact me through CLCQ, or I should have put my email address on here, but I'm at Basic Rights Queensland, so it's Kerriann, KERRIAND, at brq.org.au. Otherwise, the DV Work Aware website, Queensland contacts, come to me. If you're in other states and you're interested, go to your own state portal, and those contacts will go through to the relevant other working women's centres who'll be able to assist you.
Thanks, Kerriann. We can definitely put your contact details up at the end. And this webinar and the PowerPoint will be available early next week on our website, along with other webinars in this series and other resources. We are evaluating this program of webinars to best meet your needs, so please stay on the line and do the short survey which should pop up at the end of this webinar. We have no more questions at this stage, so I'll thank Kerriann on behalf of all of us and close the webinar now. Thank you very much, everybody.